The rain began shortly before 8 o'clock in the evening, beating heavily against the tall windows of the Magnolia Manor and blanketing the manicured gardens in a thick mist. Golden lanterns had been lit along the walkways to welcome bankers, corporate executives, journalists, and senior representatives from the Imperial Park Hotels Group. Inside the grand estate, located in the scenic mountain town of Asheville, North Carolina, the ballroom glittered under massive crystal chandeliers. Tables draped in crisp white linen held delicate crystal glassware and elaborate arrangements of fresh white magnolias. Near the main staircase, a string quartet played soft classical music, while Beatrice Vance glided among the guests with an air of supreme importance, as if every antique painting, every piece of carved mahogany, and every stone wall existed solely to validate her status. Beatrice wore a deep burgundy silk gown, her hair swept up with a vintage jewel, and around her throat rested the antique necklace she proudly called the Vance family heirloom. She moved through the crowd, whispering to high-profile attendees that this evening marked the beginning of a glorious new chapter for the estate. Though she skillfully avoided revealing the exact details before dinner, Isabella Park remained closely at her side. Dressed in dark blue, Isabella conversed smoothly with potential investors, smiling with the calm assurance of someone who already felt completely in charge of the household. When Livia entered through the side service door, virtually no one in the main hall noticed her arrival. She had spent the last several hours on the roof of the West Wing, supervising a specialized restoration crew after the sudden downpour had opened new leaks directly above the historic library. Her shirt sleeves were damp, lime dust coated the hems of her trousers, and stray strands of brown hair clung to her sweat-glistened face. The faithful housekeeper, Mrs. Clara, hurried toward her with a clean towel, but Beatrice spotted her daughter-in-law before Livia could step into the hallway. "Livia, do you honestly intend to walk across my ballroom looking like a common laborer?" Beatrice's voice cut through the ambient chatter. The quartet kept playing, but several nearby conversations trickled to a silent stop. Livia calmly unbuckled her protective hard hat, wiped her forehead, and explained that a structural slate tile had shifted over the library, making it imperative to ensure rainwater didn't ruin the rare leather-bound books below. Beatrice turned to her wealthy guests, with a dismissive, polished laugh. "She always manages to find some trivial repair job whenever she should be learning how to conduct herself as a gentleman's wife," Beatrice remarked. A few well-dressed women chuckled politely into their champagne flutes. Livia handed her hard hat to Mrs. Clara and stated she would slip upstairs to wash and change. But Beatrice shifted her position, deliberately blocking the hallway. "Before you do that, go down to the kitchen," Beatrice commanded sharply. "They are running embarrassingly behind with the appetizers for the head table." Livia locked eyes with her mother-in-law. "I do not work in the kitchen, Beatrice." "No, of course not," Beatrice sneered. "You merely live under this roof, consume our resources, and present yourself covered in dirt whenever we host distinguished guests." At that moment, Edward stepped forward holding a glass of scotch. In years past, he might have gently placed a hand on his wife's arm to diffuse his mother's public cruelty. Tonight, however, he remained rooted firmly by his mother's side. Livia looked at her husband, asking if he was aware that the dampness had reached the northern plaster structure. "That can wait until tomorrow, Livia," Edward replied coldly. "Tonight is not the night for you to turn a celebration into a technical inspection report." Off to the side, Isabella turned her face slightly to hide a subtle smile. Livia caught the gesture instantly. She also noticed that Edward's hand remained uncomfortably close to Isabella's waist, and that both of them wore identical gold lapel pins bearing the crest of the Imperial Park Corporation. "What exactly is being announced tonight, Edward?" Livia asked quietly. "You told me we would discuss any future plans together." Beatrice answered before her son could speak. A strategic partnership that will finally restore true grandeur to this estate. Livia glanced across the room at the representatives from the regional bank, then toward the corporate attorney, Richard Morton, who was whispering intently with an official notary. A partnership regarding what? Beatrice raised her chin proudly. You will find out when it becomes necessary for you to know. Just then, Mrs. Clara stepped forward and discreetly handed Livia a damp manila envelope she had discovered left on the study desk. Inside was a draft agreement detailing a complete purchase proposal for the Magnolia Manor by Imperial Park Hotels. The text described the estate as the exclusive, unencumbered property of the Vance family, entirely free of legal restrictions or third-party occupants. It outlined plans to convert the historic library into a commercial steakhouse, the staff quarters into laundry services, the historic greenhouse into a luxury spa, and a section of the surrounding woods into a paved parking lot. Livia read only the first page before raising her clear eyes to her husband. Edward, you are attempting to sell the estate. The quiet intensity of Livia's statement caught the attention of several nearby bankers. Edward stepped closer, reaching out forcefully to grab the document from her hands. Give me that, Livia. This is neither the time nor the place. No, Livia said, tightening her grip on the paper. You know you do not have the legal authority to sign this. Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Listen to her. She speaks as though she holds some grand authority over this household. Isabella joined the conversation with a layer of fake sweetness. Livia, dear, this development project will honor the historical aesthetic of the property while creating dozens of local jobs and placing the manor among the premier mountain resorts in the country. And what happens to the permanent estate staff? Livia asked directly. Will their positions be preserved? Isabella shrugged lightly. Certain operational roles will naturally need to be re-evaluated by our management team. A young houseworker named James, who was passing by with a silver tray of wine glasses, paused for a brief second. His family had lived in the small cottage near the gardens for over 17 years. Beatrice noticed the pause and immediately ordered the staff back to their duties, before addressing the room. This woman always chooses the most inappropriate moments to create an awkward scene, Beatrice announced aloud. Livia looked straight into Edward's eyes. You promised me that no major decisions regarding this property would ever be made without consulting me first. Edward kept his voice low, filled with irritation. And you promised not to air private family matters in front of business partners. His words confirmed the deep betrayal Livia had sensed creeping into her marriage for months. Edward was not merely participating in the secret negotiations. He genuinely believed her silence would continue to protect his ambition. Before she could speak further, Beatrice tapped her glass and requested the microphone. The string quartet stopped playing, and the wealthy crowd turned toward the ornate marble staircase. Beatrice spoke eloquently about legacy, lineage, and the immense financial sacrifices made by the Vance family over the decades to maintain the grand property. She claimed that following the passing of her late husband, Vincent, she and Edward had carried the crushing burden of preserving the estate entirely on their own shoulders. Standing near the side exit, with the damp envelope still in her hand, Livia felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Every sentence coming from Beatrice's lips deliberately erased the memory of Arthur Montgomery, the visionary businessman who had originally purchased the ruined mansion, funded its multi-million-dollar restoration, and allowed Vincent to reside there out of deep personal friendship. Beatrice concluded her speech by announcing the strategic acquisition deal with Imperial Park Hotels. She invited Edward and Isabella to step to the front of the ballroom. Isabella received warm applause from the investors, while Edward smiled smoothly for the society photographer's flashes. Livia felt her body grow cold, despite the warmth of the fireplace. Then Beatrice's tone shifted, growing sharp and dramatic. However, before we formalize this bright new era, We must address an unfortunate situation involving an individual who has long ceased to respect this family." The guests turned their gazes toward Livia, who remained standing in her dusty work clothes. Mrs. Clara put a hand over her mouth in distress. Edward lowered his eyes, yet he did not step away from Isabella. Beatrice announced to the room that a priceless heirloom had gone missing from her private dressing room earlier that afternoon, a diamond-encrusted pendant that had belonged to Vincent's mother. She touched her own bare neck dramatically. Though Livia had seen Beatrice wearing an entirely different piece of jewelry just an hour prior, a private security guard stepped into the hall, holding a small velvet box. Inside rested the exact pendant. "Where did you find that?" Livia asked the guard firmly. "It was tucked inside a leather travel bag in your personal room, ma'am," the guard replied coldly. Beatrice spread her hands in mock sorrow. "We welcomed this woman into our home years ago, without asking for anything in return. She arrived here with a single small suitcase, without a family name, without wealth, and without social standing. In return, she has lied, accumulated unnecessary expenses, and now attempts to steal what belongs to our legacy." Whispers rippled across the ballroom like wildfire. A local journalist quickly raised a smartphone to record the spectacle. Livia turned to her husband. "Edward, do you honestly believe I stole this?" Edward hesitated for a long moment, avoiding direct eye contact. "The necklace was found in your room, Livia. You know who that pendant belongs to." "I know exactly who it belongs to," Livia said softly, "and it certainly wasn't in my suitcase." Livia noticed a faint red mark on Isabella's forefinger, the precise spot where the sharp, old-fashioned clasp of that specific jewelry box tended to pinch the skin. Beatrice continued her public teardown, claiming that the family had tried desperately to save the marriage, but that Livia refused to fulfill her duties as a proper wife, choosing instead to spend her time with carpenters and maintenance workers rather than supporting her husband. Livia did not bother arguing against the spiteful insults. She simply asked, "Is this fabricated theft charge the real reason you staged this entire evening?" In response, Edward drew a thick white envelope from his inner jacket pocket and placed it firmly on a nearby display table. It was a formal divorce petition, accompanied by a comprehensive property settlement waiver. "It is best for everyone if we settle this without further public scandal," Edward said quietly. Livia opened the first page. The legal text stated that she acknowledged having no right, title, or claim whatsoever to any assets associated with the Vance family, waived all future legal actions, and agreed to maintain strict confidentiality regarding the resort transaction. In exchange, she would receive a modest lump-sum payout and a small one-bedroom apartment in town. Further down, a specific clause authorized Edward to continue utilizing documents previously signed by her for ongoing restoration permits. "You expect me to sign away my life tonight?" Livia asked. "It would be easier for you," Edward replied. "And if I refuse?" Beatrice signaled to two security attendants. Moments later, Livia's personal luggage was carried down the stairs and set outside on the covered porch. Rain was pouring down in torrents now. "You will walk out that door right now," Beatrice declared smoothly. "Tomorrow my legal team will decide what few belongings you may recover." Livia looked around the grand room. Some guests turned their heads away in discomfort, while others watched with cruel amusement. Richard Morton stood near the representatives from the bank, holding a leather briefcase that contained the final sale contracts. Isabella was now leaning against Edward's arm, without any pretense of discretion. The accusation, the planted necklace, the packed bags, and the divorce papers had all been carefully orchestrated for this single evening. Livia walked up to Edward. "How long have you been planning this?" "The marriage ended long before Isabella entered the picture," Edward claimed, defensive tone. "You always chose this house over me." Livia nearly let out a bitter laugh. "This house paid off your company's debts, covered your back taxes, and funded every single luxury project your mother presents to society as a Vance investment. Beatrice stepped forward, her face flushing with anger. Do not speak of my son's money as if it were your own. Livia looked at her mother-in-law with genuine pity. You truly have no idea, do you? Edward interrupted loudly, his panic rising. That is enough. Leave now. His desperate hurry to push her out confirmed what Livia had suspected. Beatrice knew far less about the true financial structure of the property than she claimed. Livia looked at her husband one final time. Are you really going to let your mother throw me out into a rainstorm from a house you know does not belong to her? The entire ballroom went dead silent. Beatrice frowned, thoroughly confused. What is she talking about? Edward stared at his wife, his lips trembling slightly as he spoke through grit teeth. Get out, Livia, before things get much worse for you. Livia nodded slowly. She did not cry, nor did she attempt to argue further. She handed the unsigned divorce papers back to the corporate attorney, walked out onto the porch, picked up her handbag, and left the heavy luggage behind in the rain. Beatrice followed her to the threshold. You walked into this manor with a tiny suitcase, and you are leaving with less than nothing. Livia stopped beneath the porch overhang as rain cascaded off the roof like a thick curtain. She turned back to look at Beatrice. You are correct about one thing, Beatrice. I am leaving without taking a single piece of furniture, because the entire estate will remain right where it has always been, registered exclusively under my name. Beatrice burst into a loud, mocking laugh, and several guests joined in, assuming it was a desperate bluff. Isabella whispered something humorous into Edward's ear, but Edward himself remained completely motionless, his face drained of all color. Livia stepped down into the heavy rain. Water soaked through her clothing within seconds. A security guard held open the side iron gate, but Mrs. Clara came running after her holding a large black umbrella. Livia gently pushed the umbrella back toward the elderly housekeeper. Keep yourself dry, Mrs. Clara, Livia said warmly. Go back inside and make sure no one touches the archives in the library. Should I call the police, ma'am? Mrs. Clara whispered anxiously. Not yet, Livia replied softly. She walked across the wet gravel toward her modest 10-year-old sedan parked near the maintenance barn. Before getting inside, she dialed her primary attorney, Sarah Jenkins. The lawyer answered on the second ring. Did they go through with it? Sarah asked immediately. Livia looked up at the brightly lit manor, where the classical music had resumed, and Beatrice was attempting to smooth over the awkward exit with her guests. Terminate the residential lease agreement immediately. Issue a complete legal block on any sale, mortgage, or transfer of the estate. Notify the county recorder's office, the regional bank, the insurance underwriters, and the property management board. Secure all digital security camera feeds and inventory logs. Sarah was silent for a few moments. Are you absolutely certain you want to trigger the emergency clause tonight? They attempted to force me to sign away the property inside my own house, Livia said calmly, and then they threw my things into the rain. Sarah advised Livia not to return to the property that night. Under the terms of the master trust, an attempted illegal sale or unlawful eviction triggered the immediate revocation of the occupant's residency rights. Livia confirmed she would check into a quiet motel near the town center and text her location. Please ensure Mrs. Clara and the grounds crew are protected, Livia added. The estate belongs to me, and those workers should not suffer for the cruelty of the Vance family. Within 20 minutes of Livia's call, Richard Morton's phone chimed with an urgent notification. The holding company, Montgomery Assets LLC, had officially revoked all legal authorizations regarding the sale, insurance coverage, and corporate representation of the Magnolia Manor. Morton turned pale and immediately pulled Edward into a private side study. Beatrice noticed the sudden movement and followed them inside. What is going on? Beatrice demanded. Morton looked at Edward with deep concern. Does Livia actually control Montgomery Assets LLC? Edward tried to answer in a whisper, but Beatrice caught the name. What company is that? Isabella entered the study a moment later, holding her phone. The executive team from Imperial Park just received an automated freeze notice from the county registrar. They are saying the Vance family does not appear on the land title as registered owners. Edward stammered, claiming there was an old legal arrangement that could be easily rectified with a minor filing. Morton shook his head firmly. The arrangement was a temporary lease agreement, Edward, not an option to sell. You assured our firm that your wife would execute the deed release tonight. She will sign it once she calms down, Edward insisted desperately. Beatrice slammed her hand on the desk. Whose name is on the title deed of this house? Edward could not meet his mother's eyes. It belongs to an asset-holding entity. Which entity? Beatrice snapped. Isabella answered for him, her voice cold. Montgomery Assets LLC, which is owned entirely by Livia. Beatrice stood completely still for several seconds, then spat out the words. That is absurd. It is fraud. Vincent lived in this house for over 20 years. He restored it. He made it the center of our family. Morton explained the stark legal reality. Length of residence does not grant ownership, Mrs. Vance. The owner paid the property taxes, maintained the master insurance policy, and renewed the occupancy agreement annually. The owner's generosity in allowing you to live here created no legal title for your family. Beatrice stared at her son in disbelief. Why did nobody tell me this? Father asked for complete discretion, Edward admitted quietly, and Livia agreed to keep it quiet to protect your pride. So you allowed me to live here for 6 years, treating that girl like a charity case while we were living in her house, Beatrice gasped. It was our home, Edward shouted back. A home is not the same thing as legal real estate, Edward, Morton corrected sharply. Beatrice walked out to the covered porch and stared down at Livia's luggage soaking in the rain. For a brief second, the magnitude of her blunder seemed to hit her, but she quickly retreated into anger. She deceived us for 6 years. She pretended to be poor just to humiliate us. Edward quickly backed his mother up. She hid everything from us. Morton looked directly at Edward. Are you telling me you didn't know she owned the holding company? Edward's silence was answer enough. Beatrice turned on her son, her eyes wide with fury. She struck him across the face with an audible slap. You let me call her an opportunist every single day while we were living off her estate. Isabella tried to intervene, suggesting they could use the family's past renovation investments to claim squatters' rights or partial ownership. Morton warned them that attempting an unauthorized sale and forcibly evicting the actual owner triggered the most dangerous clause in the occupancy contract, the immediate termination of their right to reside on the premises within 24 hours. Beatrice ordered Morton to stop the legal proceedings, but when the attorney tried to access the online property registry, his credentials had already been revoked. Edward's access to the home security system was cut off. The insurance carrier confirmed that no unauthorized personnel could remove artwork, and the regional bank froze the loan application. Imperial Park Hotels immediately issued a statement suspending all announcements. By midnight, the wealthy guests had fled the mansion, spreading the scandalous news across town. The woman thrown out into the rain was the absolute owner of the Magnolia Manor. Beatrice ordered the security guards to lock the iron gates and refuse entry to any legal process servers. However, Mrs. Clara calmly informed her that the house staff was employed directly by Montgomery Assets LLC, not the Vance family. For the first time in her life, Beatrice realized that not even the house servants owed her obedience. Edward attempted to force open the heavy wooden doors of the primary library to retrieve his father's old business files, but the lock had been changed electronically. Morton warned him that removing any physical documents or historical items would lead to immediate criminal charges. Isabella suggested taking the diamond necklace and a few valuable paintings before an official inventory could take place, but Mrs. Clara overheard the plan and stepped into the hall. "Every single item in this house has been catalogued and photographed," the housekeeper said firmly. "Nothing leaves this building." Beatrice accused Mrs. Clara of treason, but the elderly woman stood her ground. "I worked for Mr. Arthur Montgomery long before your husband ever stepped foot in this valley, Mrs. Vance. You were granted permission to live here, but you mistook permission for inheritance." Hardly anyone slept at the estate that night. Livia spent the remaining hours in a modest motel room, her wet clothes hanging over the shower rod, reviewing digital files sent by Sarah Jenkins. Land registry notified, bank accounts frozen, security camera feeds backed up, non-transfer order filed. Yet Livia felt no sense of victory, only a profound emptiness, as she realized Edward had known the truth throughout their entire marriage, choosing to use her generosity until he believed he could steal the property out from under her. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the rain had tapered off to a light drizzle. A court process server pulled up to the estate gates, accompanied by Sarah Jenkins, a county official, and 2 police officers tasked with ensuring order. When Beatrice refused to open the gates, the officer presented an emergency access order. When the heavy doors of the ballroom were opened, the process server stepped inside. Beatrice stood at the top of the marble staircase in the same burgundy dress, now wrinkled and disheveled. Edward and Isabella stood nervously near the fireplace, while Morton held a legal brief. The server's voice echoed loudly under the crystal chandeliers. "Notice is hereby given that the sole registered owner of the real property known as Magnolia Manor, including all structures, grounds, and catalogued contents, is Montgomery Assets LLC, whose sole managing member is Livia Helena Montgomery Vance." Beatrice gripped the banister tightly. The server continued, reading the order that suspended the Vance family's occupancy rights, invalidated all pending purchase agreements, and warned that any removal of property would be prosecuted as grand larceny. Edward closed his eyes in defeat. Isabella quietly took a step away from him. Mrs. Clara stood by the entryway, her face calm and dignified. The family that had thrown Livia out into the rain had finally come face to face with the reality that they owned nothing. Beatrice remained at the top of the stairs, trembling with rage. "This document is worthless," she shouted down. "My husband restored this house when it was nothing but a rotting shell. We paid for repairs, staff, landscaping, and taxes for 2 decades. A shadow company cannot erase our legacy." Sarah Jenkins stepped forward, opening a thick leather binder. She placed a certified copy of the original title deed on the table, alongside the lease contract signed by Vincent Vance, the corporate registration of Montgomery Assets LLC, and tax receipts dating back 28 years. "The holding company was established long before Livia married your son," Sarah explained calmly. "Vincent Vance was granted a limited residential lease. That contract explicitly stated he had no ownership rights." Morton attempted to argue that long-term occupancy and public perception established a legal basis for a claim. Sarah countered immediately. "Your argument fails because Vincent Vance signed an annual acknowledgement confirming that his stay was entirely permissive. Furthermore, the contract contains an explicit waiver of any adverse possession claims." Sarah drew another document from her binder, a paper bearing Vincent Vance's signature alongside 2 witnesses. It read, "I explicitly acknowledge that my family's presence in this home exists solely through the generosity of the legal owner." Beatrice stared at her son in horror. "You knew about this?" Edward remained silent. Livia then walked into the foyer. She wore simple clothes, her wet hair pulled back neatly, carrying a small laptop case. She did not look at Isabella, nor at her soaked luggage still sitting on the porch. She walked directly to the house staff, reassuring them that no one would lose their job or be removed from the staff cottages. Isabella stepped forward aggressively. "You cannot simply terminate a multi-million-dollar corporate contract without facing severe legal penalties, Livia." Livia looked at her coolly. "How much money did Imperial Park deposit into your private account, Isabella?" Isabella flushed red, but stayed quiet. Sarah chimed in, "We have already traced a $500,000 initial transfer into an unlisted account controlled by Vance Enterprises." "It was a preliminary good faith deposit," Edward protested. "You accepted money for property you did not own," Livia said simply. Edward tried to turn the blame back on her. "You hid your ownership to manipulate me. You let me act like the master of this house." Livia opened her folder and pulled out 3 printed email exchanges. In every single one, she had explicitly reminded Edward that any structural changes or corporate inquiries regarding the manor required the formal approval of Montgomery Assets LLC. In one email sent 8 months prior, Edward had replied, "Don't worry, I am only exploring theoretical ideas." "You didn't think you were the owner, Edward," Livia said softly. "You simply assumed I would stay quiet forever." Edward stepped toward her, his tone shifting from anger to desperate pleading. "Livia, this house represents my entire childhood. It's where my father taught me how to ride a horse, where we spent every single Christmas. That emotional connection has to mean something." Livia looked at him with sad clarity. "It means something as a memory, Edward, but a memory is not a land title. You can cherish a home without having the right to sell it." Beatrice interjected loudly, claiming that Arthur Montgomery had promised the house to Vincent verbally over dinner decades ago. Mrs. Clara stepped forward to correct her. "I was serving dinner that exact evening, Mrs. Vance. Mr. Montgomery told your husband that he could live here for as long as he managed the estate with honesty and integrity. He never said he was giving it away." Beatrice glared at the housekeeper, but Sarah Jenkins requested the key to the private study. When Edward claimed the antique lock was jammed, Livia walked over to a grandfather clock in the hallway, retrieved a small brass key hidden beneath its base, and unlocked the study door effortlessly. "How did you know that key was there?" Beatrice asked, stunned. "Because this clock belonged to my grandmother," Livia replied softly. "Just like the necklace you accused me of stealing." Inside the study, the scent of old paper filled the air. A dark water stain was visible on the upper ceiling, the exact spot where Livia had spent hours trying to stop the leak the previous night. She instructed 2 professional art conservators to secure the rare books immediately. Livia walked over to a secondary wall clock mounted above the fireplace, a bronze piece that Beatrice had proudly displayed to society guests for years as a gift from an European diplomat. In truth, Arthur Montgomery had bought it at an auction in Boston. Livia inserted the small key into a hidden seam behind the clock's pendulum. A soft click echoed through the room, and a section of the wooden bookshelf swung open several inches. Beatrice backed away in shock. "Vincent never showed me that secret compartment." Behind the books sat a wall safe containing the original 1998 deed, certified copies of the occupancy agreements, historical land surveys, and a sealed manila envelope marked with Beatrice's name. Sarah Jenkins carefully photographed the contents before handing the envelope to Beatrice. Inside was a letter written by Vincent Vance just months before his death. In clear, steady handwriting, he wrote that while he loved his wife dearly, he deeply regretted allowing her to treat the estate as a social status symbol. He confirmed that Arthur Montgomery had rightfully willed the holding company to Livia, and he explicitly warned, "If Edward ever attempts to commercialize this estate without Livia's full consent, do not protect him simply because he is our son." Beatrice clutched the paper to her chest, her hands shaking. He wrote this when he was sick. He wasn't in his right mind. Sarah Jenkins then drew a sealed USB drive from the safe. It contained a high-definition video recorded by Vincent in that very room. Sarah plugged it into a monitor. Vincent's face appeared on the screen, thin but clear-headed. He stated his full name, the date, and confirmed that Magnolia Manor belonged entirely to Montgomery Assets LLC, managed by Livia. He revealed that he had repeatedly rejected Edward's secret requests to transfer the land title. Then, Vincent addressed his wife directly on the recording. "Beatrice, this house was never ours. We were blessed with the privilege of living here because Arthur trusted my word. If Edward uses your vanity to try and seize this property, do not aid him. Loving our son does not require us to assist him in an act of injustice." Beatrice burst into tears, turning her eyes away from the screen. The video played on, showing Vincent acknowledging his own guilt in allowing Beatrice to pretend to be the wealthy lady of the manor, to spare her from her deep-seated shame over her impoverished upbringing. "But true dignity does not come from owning a mansion," Vincent said softly on camera. "And pretending something is ours does not make it an inheritance." When the video ended, silence hung heavy in the room. Edward tried to dismiss it, claiming a deathbed video had no standing against years of family investments. But Sarah Jenkins immediately produced the detailed financial ledgers stored in the safe. Vincent had meticulously tracked every dollar spent by the Vance family, alongside every reimbursement issued to them by Montgomery Assets LLC. There was no net financial credit in their favor. In fact, over the past 2 years, Edward had illegally siphoned off over $400,000 in event rental fees without reporting them. Livia looked at her mother-in-law. "I didn't even know that video existed, Beatrice. Your husband left it with my lawyers to protect me from this exact moment." Just then, James walked into the room holding a portable security monitor. It showed footage recorded at 2 o'clock the previous morning. Richard Morton, an engineer, and Isabella walking through the estate grounds with flashlights, marking trees for removal, and discussing the demolition of the staff cottages. On the audio track, Edward could be heard saying that Livia would not cause a scene because she always prioritized protecting the family's public reputation. The footage also captured Isabella handing the antique diamond necklace to a security guard, instructing him to place it inside Livia's blue travel bag. Beatrice grew pale as she watched the video replay. Livia looked at her mother-in-law with quiet sadness. "You knew Isabella had the necklace all along," Beatrice stammered, trying to justify herself. I thought we were just retrieving a family asset. We needed leverage to force you to accept the divorce quietly without destroying the hotel deal." "You knew I wasn't a thief," Livia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Yet you stood in front of a room full of strangers and called me one." Isabella tried to back away, claiming she was merely acting on legal advice. But Sarah Jenkins informed her that framing someone for grand theft, planting evidence, and using false criminal accusations to extort a property waiver carried severe criminal penalties. By noon, news of the scandal had spread throughout Asheville, but Edward and Richard Morton refused to surrender. They launched an aggressive public relations campaign to frame Livia as a cold, calculating woman who had manipulated an unsuspecting family. Morton leaked a selective document to local newspapers titled "The Real Story of Magnolia Manor," claiming that Livia had secretly hidden her immense wealth for 6 years, allowed her elderly mother-in-law to pour her heart into maintaining the estate, and then maliciously revealed the land title at the most embarrassing moment possible. Edward released a self-recorded video outside the gatehouse, claiming he had unknowingly married a woman who secretly controlled every aspect of his family's life. "She watched my mother invest her soul into this home, without ever mentioning she could evict us with a single signature," Edward claimed tearfully to the camera. His statement conveniently ignored the fact that he had known about the holding company for years and had repeatedly begged Livia to keep the arrangement secret from his mother. Meanwhile, Sarah Jenkins and Livia remained inside the study, cataloging the estate's financial records. They discovered that Edward had secretly rented out the gardens, ballroom and greenhouse for private corporate retreats, pocketing over $3 million over 3 years through Vance Enterprises while letting the roof leaks go completely unrepaired. Furthermore, a forensic audit of Edward's computer revealed an even darker scheme. 4 months prior, while Livia was hospitalized for 2 days following a minor fall at a construction site, Edward had forged her digital signature on a conditional power of attorney document. The document granted him full authority to manage Montgomery Assets LLC if Livia were ever declared legally incapacitated. Edward had even paid a private physician to draft a preliminary assessment, claiming Livia suffered from severe mental exhaustion and compulsive control issues, using her intense dedication to architectural restoration work as evidence of psychological instability. They planned to use my dedication to my work to declare me unfit, Livia realized, reading the draft court petition. If a judge had granted Edward temporary guardianship, he would have signed over the estate to Imperial Park before I could even leave the hospital. Sarah Jenkins shook her head in disgust. It's a classic tactic. Provoke someone continuously, and then use their natural emotional reaction as proof of instability. When confronted with the forged power of attorney documents, the doctor involved admitted he had never personally examined Livia and had been paid directly from an account linked to Isabella's shell company, Aurora Development. The Attorney General's office immediately opened a formal investigation into Richard Morton and Edward for forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Despite the mounting evidence against them, Morton filed an emergency petition for adverse possession on behalf of Beatrice, claiming she had occupied the property openly, as its owner, for over 20 years. The filing included magazine features and party invitations, showing Beatrice acting as the hostess of the manor. However, Sarah Jenkins quickly dismantled the petition by presenting original tax receipts, proving that Montgomery Assets LLC had paid all property taxes, insurance premiums, and major structural repair bills. Moreover, the magazine articles submitted by Morton had been heavily edited. Original uncropped photographs retained by the photographer showed Livia actively directing the restoration crews in the background, while Beatrice simply posed for the camera. With his legal strategies collapsing, Edward attempted one last private meeting with Livia in the manor's courtyard. "Livia, please," Edward pleaded, looking exhausted. "If the bank forecloses on Vance Enterprises, I will lose everything. My business will go bankrupt, and I could face prison time. Just sign the agreement with Imperial Park. They will pay off all my debts, and we can give my mother a comfortable condo in town." Livia looked at the man she had been married to for 6 years. "You are still asking me to sell my heritage to cover up your crimes, Edward." "It's the only way to save everyone," he insisted. "Save who, Edward?" Livia asked quietly. "Save the ground staff who would be fired. Save the historical library that would be turned into a commercial bar. Or save you from facing the consequences of your own choices." Edward had no answer. The following morning, the final legal confrontation took place at a grand conference hall in downtown Charlotte, where representatives from Imperial Park Hotels, the regional bank, state prosecutors, and news outlets had gathered. Morton tried to argue one last time that his clients had acted in good faith, but Sarah Jenkins presented the complete, unedited digital paper trail. The forensic evidence proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Edward, Isabella, and Morton had conspired to forge Livia's signature on loan applications totaling over $12 million, using Magnolia Manor as unauthorized collateral. The representative from the state licensing board stepped forward and announced the immediate suspension of Richard Morton's law license pending criminal indictment. The regional bank immediately froze all accounts associated with Vance Enterprises and initiated fraud recovery proceedings. Isabella tried to distance herself from the disaster, but prosecutors revealed text messages showing she had personally organized the transfer of the stolen necklace to frame Livia. She was served with a formal indictment for conspiracy and framing an innocent person. Beatrice sat in the conference hall, her hands trembling as she realized the truth. The wealth, the prestige, and the social standing she had spent 2 decades constructing were completely gone, destroyed not by Livia, but by her own son's greed and her own blind vanity. She looked across the table at Livia. "Are you happy now that you have stripped us of everything?" Livia looked at her mother-in-law with steady, quiet eyes. "I didn't strip you of anything, Beatrice. You built a life on a foundation of lies, and when the wind blew, it simply fell apart." The corporate board of Imperial Park Hotels immediately canceled the acquisition contract, fired Isabella, and issued a public apology to Livia, offering a massive settlement to avoid a high-profile corporate lawsuit. Livia officially took full physical possession of Magnolia Manor. She established the Magnolia Heritage Foundation, a non-profit trust designed to preserve the historical integrity of the estate, protect the surrounding forest land, and maintain the staff cottages for the permanent workers who had cared for the grounds for decades. Under the terms of the new foundation, the Grand Library was open to historical researchers and the public, while the historic greenhouse was converted into a community horticulture center. A portion of the West Wing was dedicated as a temporary sanctuary for women recovering from financial abuse and domestic hardship, providing them with safe shelter and professional career training. Beatrice was given 30 days to pack her personal belongings and move into a quiet, comfortable 2-bedroom townhouse in Asheville, funded entirely by a modest stipend provided by Livia out of respect for Vincent's memory. She was permitted to take her personal clothing, her books, and her family photo albums, but the antique furniture, artwork, and historical heirlooms remained where they belonged, as permanent assets of the estate foundation. On the day of Beatrice's departure, a moving van pulled up to the main driveway. Mrs. Clara carefully packed Beatrice's personal items into neat boxes. There was no public scene, no shouting, and no news cameras. Livia stood on the front porch as Beatrice walked down the stone steps for the final time. Beatrice stopped near the bottom step, looking up at the grand mansion that had defined her social identity for over 20 years. "I spent 20 years believing this house made me important," Beatrice said softly, her voice carrying a rare note of genuine reflection. "A house is just stone and timber, Beatrice," Livia replied gently. "It cannot give you dignity if you do not carry it inside yourself." Beatrice nodded slowly, got into the back seat of the car, and was driven away. Edward faced multiple corporate fraud charges, resulting in severe financial penalties and the total liquidation of Vance Enterprises. Stripped of his wealth and social standing, he was forced to relocate to a small town in eastern North Carolina to start over as a junior real estate manager, far away from the elite social circles he had worked so hard to impress. 1 year later, on a cool autumn evening, Livia stood on the upper terrace of Magnolia Manor. Below, the lanterns along the garden pathways shone softly through the evening mist, illuminating the pristine white magnolias that bloomed near the library wing. In the end, true human dignity is never found in the grand titles we claim, the luxurious houses we inhabit, or the superficial status symbols we display to the world. It is forged entirely through the quiet integrity of our actions, the honesty of our character, and our willingness to stand firm in the truth when tested by betrayal. We often observe individuals who become so consumed by the illusion of power and possession that they mistake permission for absolute ownership and generosity for weakness. They build elaborate lives upon the fragile sands of pretense, convinced that their social standing or wealth elevates them above the basic principles of fairness and respect. Yet, as time inevitably reveals, no amount of wealth or deception can permanently disguise a lack of moral foundation. When the storms of reality hit, the structures built on falsehood inevitably crumble, leaving behind only the stark truth of who we really are. To navigate life with genuine grace requires understanding that true strength does not lie in dominating others, retaliating against cruelty, or clutching tightly to material possessions. Real strength is demonstrated in the quiet courage to protect what is right, to extend compassion even to those who have wronged us, and to ensure that our power is used to uplift those who cannot defend themselves. Livia did not reclaim Magnolia Manor out of a desire for revenge, nor to celebrate the humiliation of the family that had mistreated her. She reclaimed it because she understood that a home is meant to be a sanctuary of truth, shelter, and legacy, not a weapon used to oppress others, or a commodity to be traded for greedy ambition. By choosing integrity over bitterness, and stewardship over personal greed, she transformed a place once defined by vanity into a beacon of hope, proving that the ultimate measure of our character is found not in what we possess, but in how we choose to live when the truth is finally laid bare.